So last time I was on this stage, actually it was a little bit different. It was over there in Rupp Arena, and it was a big moment to a certain degree. We were kicking something off. We were launching something that we call Working Together for a Planet of Plenty, and it's amazing to think that that's 3 years now on. A mission, a vision of Alltech for the future, a mission and vision for our industry, and something that we see as much bigger than just us. And of course, that was a little bit of us stepping forward and saying, this is the direction that we want to go. But at Alltech, we do build strong relationships with people, and we are able to connect with them, and we're able to, I think, build a lot of rapport and honesty. And so the other day, we were in a meeting with some of our Asian colleagues that came in a little bit early. And the question was asked, when Mark talked about Planet of Plenty in 2019, what did you think about it? And one hand went up, and the answer was, I didn't really get it. It was a bit ambivalent, and I wasn't really sure what I was supposed to do. And it's amazing to me what has transpired in the last 3 years, how that was the feeling at that moment, and how that has changed. And I think that's simply an example of how, when you demonstrate the direction you want to go, people will join you, they will become part of this. This is something that is deeply rooted in Alltech DNA, in the way that Dr. Lyons spoke and the impact that he wanted us to have. He talked about it not being about making money, it was about making a difference, it was about making an impact. And that was his idea, and he brought that idea to the farm. He brought that idea to a new industry, a new country that he hadn't experienced before, using the capabilities, the knowledge he had with his fermentation background, and looking at things differently, looking at things also as a marketeer. He launched something at this conference back in the late 1980s called the ACE principle. And it came through a collaboration, a conversation with a professor from Italy who was saying, Pierce, what you are doing is ACE. It stands for the benefit for the animal, the consumer, and the environment. This today is something, of course, that many businesses are thinking about. We're constantly thinking about that consumer, how they're changing. How do we adapt to them? How do we connect with them? Especially that younger consumer that Heather was just talking about. But he was thinking about this that long ago, that long-term vision, and that way we can go for the future. So just a few days after he passed away, we got a call from a journalist from the Wall Street Journal. They were writing up an obituary, and they asked a surprising question. I was anticipating them just asking, what was Pierce Lyons like? What was it like being his son? What were different things you did together? But they asked this, well, it's all fair and good. What's your vision for the future? And it was a bit surprising. And of course, growing up in the business, having had the opportunity to travel with him, I really thought, wow, all those things we've talked about, ACE principle, all that we've been building on for years, that's all still true. And actually, even more so, that is certainly an idea whose time has come. I had the great opportunity to travel with my father. I was afforded tremendous opportunities to live in different countries, experience different cultures. And what I learned through that was in many places in the world, we are very, very special. We are very lucky. Many places, people are still simply looking for enough calories, enough nutrition for today, having enough to get from today till tomorrow. In other places, very much as some of those younger individuals that we hear about, who I would say truly are global, they are thinking about food in a different way. The products they buy, the brands they wear, the food they eat represents who they are. And so they are much more aspirational. And when we think about the hierarchy of needs, these are individuals right at the top. We have to connect with all of them. We as an industry have to respond to those needs, and we have to think about how we can connect with them and make sure we can provide enough for today, but we also can realize that in many regards, those same consumers or their children are going to be the consumers very focused on value-added, on sustainably produced, in many other regards as well. This is a very, very fast-changing place, and it's not going to look the same all around the world. But in looking at a few things in preparation for this talk, I came across this, and it was one of those things, you're reading a book, and you see a statistic, and you go back and you study it, and you look it up from different ways, this was absolutely shocking to me. And it really brought home that inequality and that divide, the different worlds that we have around the planet. 40% of our world today, 3.1 billion people, are actually only using the same energy as individuals in France and Germany were using in 1860. So in this country, when we were just in the beginning throes of the Civil War, that is absolutely shocking. Just take a minute to think about that. They haven't yet started to use the energy, 40% of the world, that we were using 160 years ago. So what does that mean? It means that they should be afforded the opportunity. They actually have to be afforded the opportunity. If we want to have a planet of plenty, how can we hold 40% and even more of our planet behind? They should be doubling, tripling the energy use, and even that is minuscule compared to what we utilize. So in order for them to have greater prosperity, we know they're going to be burning more fossil fuels. Our entire economy is completely connected to the burning of fossil fuels. It really doesn't matter what sector we're talking about. So we can see that reducing is not enough. We have to do something different. The reductions, the commitments the governments make, the companies make, that isn't going to get us where we need to go. We have to have intentional action to restore our environment. We have to be thinking of ways where we can lower environmental impact, but at the same time, we can provide enough of that nutrition that this growing planet is going to require. We have to cultivate economic opportunities through this. I think that message, that negative message of doing less, of not being able to have economic opportunities, entrepreneurial opportunities, even intellectual opportunities, that is not a path forward as we see it. We have to think about ways where we can truly capture what has been released. I think this is going to be the most exciting and the biggest economic opportunity that exists in agriculture for the future. How do we create carbon capture in a transformative way? We know that our soils have so much potential. The area that I studied for my PhD holds a key to this. Filamentous fungi, fermentation, tremendous, tremendous opportunities to be tapped into. So all of that was great. We were launching Planet of Plenty. The teams were getting on board. We had many, many places where they were creating their own Planet of Plenty partners. We have several in the room today. We were creating bespoke programs, customer by customer, making sure that they could achieve the targets and the goals they had, that they would have access to the creative minds within Alltech to be able to think about things differently, and we were truly sitting on the same side of the table. Things are going great. And then a bit of complication, 2022. Certainly we know this year has started with some things we did not anticipate. We have a war, and that war is not just having that human tragedy, that human impact in Ukraine, it's having a much longer and much greater far-reaching impacts around the globe. And we can see this, of course, because as many of us know in agriculture, fertilizer, where does it come from? Ukraine, Russia. What about the breadbasket of Europe? What about so much that happens behind the scenes within the agri-food chain that most people, consumers, policymakers, governmental individuals are not aware of? And we, of course, are seeing dramatic responses. Inflation at levels that we have not anticipated and have not seen for years. This is simply the change since we were last together. Look at these extraordinary numbers. 219% increase in the price of corn, over 200% in soybeans, almost 300% in terms of wheat. And this is only going to be something that continues. How do we respond with such dramatic change? How do we make sure that we stay focused on what we have started to do, on those ambitions and those objectives that we've had? And then, of course, what's the local, what's the individual impact? What's that anxiety that we are seeing? Whether it's in richer countries like the UK, here in the US, or the even bigger impact when we think about actual food scarcity in many, many places. This is basically since the beginning of Alltech, we have not had this big an increase in terms of the grocery bill here in the United States. Extraordinary big jumps, things that are really getting people's attention. But that's those of us who are lucky enough to be able to go to a grocery store and access that food. What about those who are experiencing extreme hunger? Over 10 million more this year than last year. That is what truly alarms me, what it really should be alarming all of us. The last time we had the Arab Spring, of course, what really drove that? It was food prices. And it's that selfishness that we see in activities, weaponizing food, something that should be absolutely beyond the pale, that is driving so much and holding us back from that true ability we have to nourish the world. So is it our planetary bounds that's limiting us, or is our human inability to collaborate and work together? So I think it makes it really clear when you think about all of these elements that sustainability, as Paul Pullman said, keeping the status quo isn't enough. This is certainly a time that calls us to do more, to move forward and think about things in a different way. We have to be positive for our planet. We have to do more than we potentially would. And I actually think this is where we get everybody in the room. People who are business builders, entrepreneurs, technologists, they have a role to play in this. When we think only about cutting, we eliminate, we alienate many who would be a big part of this story. So it's our belief that agriculture has the greatest positive potential to influence the future of our planet, that we can provide nutrition for all, that we can help rural communities to thrive, and we can replenish our planet's resources. And we can do all of this really as we continue to conserve, different in a way that any other industry can. There's really only forestry and agriculture that is a primary function sequester carbon. And through this, agriculture can help to restore our soils, and we can also come up with so many new practical ways to think about things. We have an ability also to scale. I think it was one of the elements that my father enjoyed the most. Where does agriculture exist? Agriculture is everywhere. And so you're able to go, you're able to experience, so many of the challenges, the experiences that we have, we can share with each other. And the ability to scale this industry and scale ideas is so powerful. We are truly at the interface of two big ideas: nourishing the present and the preservation of the future. So now I want to take you to a special place down in Florida called Buck Island. Interesting pick, Vaughn.
You
We
like
let
that?
everybody pick their walk-up music, so you're getting some insights into these personalities. So Dr. Vaughn Holder heads up our ruminant research, and I've asked him to be with me today. Vaughn and I talk a lot about topics, and a little bit what we were trying to do there is a lot of this can get a little bit hairy-fairy. They can get, highfalutin, very elitist ideas. What we need to do is have concrete actions and examples. And so that story there in Buck Island is one of those. Vaughn, you and I, we message a lot, we talk a lot about, it seems like anything comes across the newsreels or the latest Dr. Frank Mitloehner tweet, we're discussing it. Give us a little bit of a sense of the reality when you think about, especially the ruminant area, the impact and maybe the perception and reality around the agriculture's impact on the environment.
Yeah, Mark, thank you. This is a pretty important area, right? We're talking about, we literally sit at the interface between the main carbon capturing industry in the world and the main food production industry in the world. Those things are kind of tied closely together and unavoidable. So I think we sit in a unique position to be doing something about the whole carbon argument. But I do want to point out on the front end of this that it's really important that we don't talk about compromising the one for the other, because we have to do both. We have to both produce food and we have to do something about the environment because we're in a position to do something about the environment. So what's the problem with that, right? I think it's important that we quantify what's going on to start off with before we go and start pointing fingers about who's doing it or who should be doing something about it. But let's talk about what we actually have. What is the reality of what's going on in the environment right now? So these aren't my data. I wish I could say they were, but they're not. This actually comes off of the NASA website. This is National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration data. This is carbon dioxide and methane as measured in the atmosphere going 1 million years back. And no, we didn't measure it 1 million years back. This comes from ice cores. But the data on the right-hand side of the graph, where it goes vertical, because you can't even see it's a curve because it's going up so fast, is the rise in methane and CO2. And that's a problem. And it's a problem because those gases cause warming. We talk about climate. We're not talking about blame here. We're talking about what is going on in the atmosphere. The curve on the left comes straight off of NOAA's website, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration data. You can see the top culprits, always the culprits. In blue is CO2, in orange is methane. You can see that both are pretty significant contributors on the curve on the left. CO2 is obviously rising pretty quickly, but methane is one that we need to be concerned about. Interestingly, Frank tells us that methane is not really accumulating in the atmosphere if we don't continue contributing to it. You can sort of see that here. But the most important part about methane on this curve is that if we take that methane out, if we stop producing that methane, we don't even have to capture it. If we stop producing that methane, that warming goes away. And that represents a unique opportunity on the methane front for us to start doing things about methane and induce some cooling in the short term. But I think this is really important that we realize this because we are very hyper-focused on methane. The curve on the right, I've corrected that data set to 1979 and said, what has contributed to warming the most since 1979? It's not hard to interpret that graph, although, Heather, there's your hole in the ozone layer right there from the CFCs, but it's CO2. We can do something about methane in the short term, but CO2 is accumulating in the environment and it is the primary contributor to warming. So we need to be thinking about methane, yes, but what are we going to do for the long term for carbon dioxide?
Now this project that we've done, this is a little bit unique. It's a unique place, but it's also a unique approach. And I think to a certain degree, Alltech has had research alliances for years. That was a very successful program launched by Dr. Dawson. What is unique with this partnership?
This is really cool, and it took us a long time to really realize how unique this was. So this is, you'll hear it referred to by a number of names. One is Buck Island Ranch, which is the actual ranch where the cattle are. And one is Archibald Expeditions, which is the ecological research group that is housed on that ranch. It's a pretty unique combination of scientists to put together. Usually they are on opposite ends of the spectrum screaming at each other. put ecologists together with ruminant nutritionists on a ranch and see what they can do. And in this ranch, there is a lot of technology that allows us to understand what the association between cattle and the environment are. Essentially, cattle as a part of an ecosystem. What does that do? What does that do for the production side of the business, but also what does it do to the ecology? What is the net effect on the environment? Really unique place.
And through that, what is it that you've experienced? What is the team? It has been, even on our side, it's been interesting. We're pulling in people from different areas that perhaps just aren't in your ruminant space.
Sure.
What have you guys discovered? What have you learned?
I'm going to pivot a little bit, Mark, because I'm going to tell you what we thought we were going to do, and then I'm going to tell you what we are doing. So we started off looking at, well, we're going to take our technologies, we're going to go there, and we're going to look at what the effect is when we use a technology. This, for example, is a blueprint trace mineral technology that we use. We want to understand, well, what's that going to do to the environmental footprint of cattle production? And we've done this pretty successfully in multiple places, looking at what the intervention does with in-feed technologies to the carbon footprint. And it's pretty cool. We get these types of scale of responses from simple nutritional interventions. 5% reduction in the carbon footprint of a beef product is in the realm of all the other interventions that we hear about. So what changed? This is not what we're doing at Buck Island. We've taken these measurements at Buck Island, but that's not what we're doing there. And that's because of this. Because they are able to measure the effect of the ecosystem. We're not talking about the cow as the production unit. The ecosystem is producing the beef. That's a really important mind shift that we've had to make going into this place. It's the ecosystem producing the beef. And yes, here's the headline that you see in the press, the one on Monday morning, Mark, that you're contacting me about and saying, is this true? What do we do about this? The emissions are, we've got 3,000 cows there. There's 11,000 tons of carbon going into the atmosphere every year. 64% of that is coming out of the cattle. It's really bad. But hey, what about the rest of the ecosystem? Look at those Bahia grass pastures that they have down there. Those pastures are sequestering almost 18,000 tons of carbon. That ecosystem is net positive sequestration by a lot. I mean, we're not even talking about a little bit. This is not neutral. This ecosystem is pulling a ton of carbon, or a lot of tons of carbon out of the environment. So it's really important to look at the ecosystem and understand it from that point of view. And Mark, this really gets to it, and this is later data from them. This is something that was published a couple of years ago now, but the comeback is always, well, pull the cattle off that land and it's going to be even better. Well, that's why we study the ecosystem, right? So I'm going to have to walk you through this for just a second, but you've got this curve at the top here. I don't think a laser pointer is going to work on here, but the gray curve at the top of each of those curves is methane production. You can see on the grazed pastures versus the ungrazed pastures, there's more methane coming out of those animals, or out of the ecosystem, right? Because there's ruminants on them. But wait a second, the gray curve at the bottom is net ecosystem exchange. That's basically how much carbon is either going into the ecosystem or coming out of the ecosystem. Looks like grazing is causing a lot of carbon to go back down into that ecosystem. But perhaps on the converse side, the coolest thing is you don't have ruminants there. All of a sudden, with no cattle, you're producing both methane and net carbon emission from a natural ecosystem. So these are the really important things that we have to understand as we move forward in the science of trying to manipulate sequestration to have important environmental outcomes.
So essentially, without the animals, we're actually in a much worse situation than with them.
In that case, absolutely. That pasture actually ends up.
Because this is part of the, I remember I realized at the start of the pandemic that there was only one state I hadn't visited yet. And I thought, well, I better get there as soon as I can. And it was Montana. And we had the opportunity to go to Yellowstone, Wyoming, but a little bit in Montana. And we had a question, which was, we were chatting with the guy. He said, how many bison are there, in the U.S. now? And I think there's 100,000, something around there, maybe a bit more. They said, well, what were they before? We said, well, estimates are between 50 and 70 million bison roaming what is the United States today, really around 1800. So you just think about that level of animals. And what did the pastures look like? pretty good. And so you just think about that, and you think about the systems approach. That gave me a little bit of ambition in terms of thinking, how could this scale? What is the potential?
Yeah, and that's really important. And those figures have been compared before, obviously, that they think, as much as they know, that the historical bison herds and our current bovine herds, which are also bovines, are actually quite comparable. That's a really important thing. But yeah, how do we scale this, right? You need economics behind something to scale something. I mean, no matter how good anybody's intentions are, if there isn't economics behind something, you can't scale it. And I think that's the vital role that agriculture sits in, because, again, we capture carbon for a living. So this shouldn't be a stretch for us. But we need to talk about the scale and what we understand about the scale. This is a meta-analysis from last year, so this is really recent. 300 publications reviewed in this one, looking at the effect of interventions on beef production systems and what they do to net greenhouse gas emissions, right? And what they found is pretty interesting. In fact, if you look at the 8% reduction that you see at the top of that figure there, that's from standard nutrition, animal science type interventions, breeding, feed efficiency modifiers, these types of things. And we can move it. We know we can move the needle with that, but that's an average. Average interventions cause about 8% reduction. But when we manipulate carbon sequestration, if we can, the average intervention is more than 40%, 46% reduction in carbon footprint of beef by putting in place practices. A lot of cases it's grazing, but there's some other practices that we can do that improve carbon sequestration. We've just got a much bigger pot to deal with right there. There's 3 times the amount of carbon in the soil than there is in all living plants and animals on land. So that pot is really big, and our ability to manipulate it is going to become more and more important.
So Vaughn, why hasn't it happened yet? What are the obstacles?
Yeah, so this is a really technical question, and there's a lot of people working on this right now. The primary reason why this is a challenge at the moment is because, first of all, it's a bit of mind shift, right? We've got a lot of people still thinking of like animal scientists, and we need a lot more people thinking like ecological scientists, talking about producing food with ecosystems rather than with animals. But there's some methodological limitations, right? The science, I think, if you've got a place like Buck Island where you have a bunch of technology and you have eddy covariance towers to measure methane and all these good things is fine, but how do we do this on a ranch? How do we do this on our ranch next door where we don't want to implement all this technology? We need to model that. And because no one's agreed upon how to model that sequestration, everyone is suspicious of everybody else's models. That's a real problem, because we want to get to the situation where we're trading this carbon, right? I mean, that's the ultimate goal, is to put money in the rancher's pocket for doing the right thing. And that becomes a real challenge when you don't have the models to put together. And of course, these vary. This is biology. This is not physics like from Noah at the beginning of the graph. This doesn't work the same everywhere you use it, and we need to be able to figure out how to measure that on site.
So we have to create those models, and I think that's a big part of it. What are the new business models that can be created?
Yeah.
I think that's a big part of it. So that kind of comes back to the question, what is it that we need to shift? We have a group of extraordinary individuals here. Some of this begins, of course, with us. How do we begin that changing of the mindset?
Well, it has to begin with us. I really honestly believe that no one else is positioned in the way that we are to do something about this. Again, our job is to capture carbon. We've got to go a few steps down the line to actually get that carbon down into the soil, but that's, I believe, technicality at this point. But we do need a change in mindset, right? We needed a change in mindset as a research group when we went to Buck Island, away from the animal, away from just looking at feed efficiency and looking at what the collateral effect is on the environment, right? Well, it'll be great if we get something alongside with it. We're going to need to change our mindset to have primary focus on the environmental piece of this simultaneously with the food production, because I believe that totally. We cannot lose sight of the food production piece of this, as Nikki's going to talk to you a lot about later. And if we do that, we end up having 2 different revenue streams for the farmer, one being the actual primary product that they produce, but also looking at sequestration. And this is a bit tongue-in-cheek, this one. Is it food? Are we going to be farming for food or for sequestration? And I've already said it. We can't do one or the other. We cannot compromise either of these to do the other one. We have to do both. And so I think it's going to require a shift in mindset. I think, again, we get a lot of negative press as an industry. Agriculture does. We're the only people that can do something about this. We've gone from having the most important job in the world, and that's feeding people. And we're not just talking about calories, we're talking about nutrients. Nikki's going to go into that in a lot more detail than I could. But we've got to preserve the future of the planet. Again, it's beyond sustainability, right? We're talking about what are we doing to preserve this planet for future generations, and we're in a position to do it, so we have to do it.
Thank you. Thank you, Vaughn. Thanks very much, and we'll see you again in a minute.
Thank you.
So what I find refreshing and exciting about that is it really shows you something that's possible. That 50% is an extraordinary number. And that's the type of thinking that we have to have. Those are the types of headlines that we should be thinking about. That's the systems change, where we can be thinking as people who take care of an ecosystem, who are producing food, but also capturing carbon and changing things. When we think about the values of Alltech, one of the most important is exactly what just created that type of a project. It's the power of curiosity. Be curious, one of our 7 values within our organization. And that really spurs on a lot when we think about the intersection between science and business and that passion we have for entrepreneurialism. It opens up so many possibilities. It's a little bit why a lot of people say, gosh, what is it that Alltech's doing? You're doing this thing and that thing and the other thing. And sometimes it was a bit difficult to kind of pull all those together. And that's actually where this mission of working together for a planet of plenty has truly helped us to pull in those aspects. So some of the areas that you might not be as familiar with within Alltech are areas that we have been putting a big focus on. And you can see, of course, the way we're thinking in terms of the impact that soil will have. Our crop science business, which has been a tremendously successful business for over 30 years, but somewhat geographically isolated, is a business we have been putting a great amount of focus on since we saw you last. We're also putting a great focus on aquaculture, extending what we're doing not just in terms of our business in Alltech Copens and Alltech Wabi, but also now thinking globally, how do we grow that business and the research impact we can have as well. We have a tremendous lifestyle business that helps us to connect with consumers and understand them better, putting another focus, again, back on the horse, as we did in 2010 and 2014 when we had the Alltech FEI World Equestrian Games. But one of the businesses that we always had an ambition for, and that our scientists told us we should focus on, was human nutrition and human health. We knew for years the role that selenium could play on brain health. In fact, we connected and partnered with the University of Kentucky, the Sanders Brown Center on Aging, and we've been working with them for now over 2 decades. So human nutrition was always something we wanted to think about. And right here at the One, there was an idea that was launched. It was one of our accelerator companies, and it actually came from within Alltech. And that, of course, was Acutia. And Acutia, as a business, was launched during the pandemic. I think this is one of the special things. You can bring people into your organization. Dr. Holder grew up within Alltech. Nikki Putnam Badding also joined us as a human nutritionist and became an entrepreneur. And she launched Acutia last year, and it's tremendous to have her with us to share a little bit of a nutritionist's perspective working within an agricultural world. So Nikki, please join us.
It is always great to be at the Alltech ONE Conference. I'm thrilled to be back because this is a conference where big ideas are discussed. And Dr. Holder just shared with us a huge and impactful idea that we as an industry should be protecting the planet and also nourishing all the people on it. That is a big idea. And I'd like to set the stage for further discussion on human nutrition by thinking about sustainability in a new way. Maybe the true meaning of sustainability in agriculture isn't just environmental impact. Sustainability doesn't begin and end with environmental impact. It actually means that we're taking care of the health of the planet and the people who share it. So let's start our conversation with a statistic that many of you have likely heard time and time again. The global population is forecast to exceed 10 billion by the year 2060, raising overall food production demand by 70% in that same time period. And we're often told, as folks who work in the agriculture industry, that feeding the world is our responsibility. But this is not our true challenge. These are the faces of malnutrition. Many of them may not look like what you'd expect. And 1 in 10 people on our planet are undernourished. And world hunger is unfortunately back on the rise again due to geopolitical conflict, climate change, and a global pandemic. But even more startling, 1 in 4 people worldwide is suffering from malnutrition. The global burden of malnutrition in all of its forms, lack of access to food and calories, protein and micronutrient deficiencies, and being overweight, obese, or diagnosed with related non-communicable diseases like cardiovascular disease and diabetes, affect over 2 billion people. And sometimes I think just saying the word malnourished doesn't fully illustrate the devastating impact that inadequate nutrient intake can have on an individual. From complications in pregnancy and childbirth, to infant death, to risk of infectious disease, increased risk of chronic disease like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and Alzheimer's disease, decreased cognitive function, poor mental health, a reduced life expectancy, all due to inadequate nutrition. And that is not to mention the social and economic consequences. Slowed economic growth, this vicious, perpetuated cycle of poverty and malnutrition, a reduced number of children who can attend school, a reduced number of adults who can enter and stay in the workforce, and an increased gender gap. The impact of malnutrition is far-reaching. So, is it enough to just feed the world? Or rather than feed the world, do we need to provide nutrition for all and change the dialogue from food security to nutrition security? I've put a lot on your shoulders here. We're asking every one of you in the room to feed the world and provide more food, 70% more food by 2060 than you're producing right now. And not only do you need to provide more food, you need to provide nutrition and adequate nutrient intake for everyone. That's overwhelming. That's a lot to shoulder, especially first thing in the morning at a conference. Believe me, I understand. I'm a dietitian. My entire profession is based upon bringing proper nutrition to the masses. And I have worked with some of those faces of malnutrition that we saw. I spent time in rural Peru working with women and children who were suffering from undernutrition. They were malnourished because they did not have enough access to food and nutrients beyond the potatoes that were grown in their community. And several years later, I spent time in the eastern part of this state, in Kentucky, working with mothers and children who were also suffering the consequences of malnutrition, but not due to lack of access of food. They actually had plenty of access to food, but they lived in what's called a food desert. They did not have access to fresh fruits and vegetables, dairy products, meat, eggs, fish, etc. They were living off packaged products, but they were suffering similar consequences. I was overwhelmed by this. I felt there was little that I could do, even as a nutrition professional. There was little that the healthcare sector could do alone. And that's when I turned to agriculture. I have worked in this industry ever since because agriculture truly has the opportunity to be the world's hero, to be the solution to malnutrition, to place nutritional quality at the heart of agricultural practices. Let's take a quick look back at the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution, with implementation of new farming practices and use of biofortification, it saved the lives of over 1 billion people from starvation, and it increased food yield by 44% between 1965 and 2010. Those are amazing feats, incredible. And although the Green Revolution helped us get our arms around this world hunger problem, didn't solve it, but we got our arms around it a bit. It did encourage a global food system focused on delivery of calories over nutrients. And over time, coupled with the economic drivers of yield and cost, nutrition has been overshadowed. Now, I'm careful to criticize the Green Revolution because I myself have never experienced prolonged hunger. I've never seen a family member die of starvation. So I recognize my privilege to stand here and ask for more out of the food system. But I wonder, can we deliver both quality and quantity? I think this is where the conversation gets really exciting. This is where we talk about what's being done, what can be done. We heard a bit from Dr. Holder. He shared some incredible information with us. Are we going to be farming for food or farming for carbon sequestration? And that food is a byproduct. But starting our conversation about human nutrition, we'll start in the soil. This notion of soil health's impact on human health, it's not new, but it has been receiving a lot of attention in recent years. But really, from the beginning of time, indigenous people have thought that soil health and human health were synonymous. And Hippocrates felt that you needed to evaluate soil health in a proper medical evaluation of a patient. An early publication on crop science stated that the fertility of soil determines the health of a plant. And the USDA in 1938 said that soil was the origin for essential nutrients for human health. In fact, there are 14 nutrients that are essential for plant growth and plant health that are also essential for human health. I have 4 of those micronutrients listed behind me, and they're listed as deficiencies because these are the 4 most common micronutrient deficiencies worldwide. And there are some really interesting case studies found globally, found in different regions of the world, showing that with use of micronutrient-enriched fertilizers or selective regenerative farming practices, we can actually bring those nutrients back to the soil, bring the nutrients back to the plants, and in some of these case studies, they have all but eradicated these micronutrient deficiencies in those areas of the world, all because they focused on dirt. That is absolutely amazing. When we focus on soil health, can soil health be the foundation for nutrition security? And now that we know that soil health deeply impacts the health of the plants, we know that not all plants are created equal. The conventional assumption is that if you go into the supermarket, a carrot is a carrot, an apple is an apple. They have the same nutritive value. But it's not the case. In a study that was published last year by the Bionutrient Institute, they had surveyed crops over 3 years, and they had created a spectrum of crops that were grown with nutrient density in mind and crops that were grown without nutrient density as a driver. So we have the high end of the spectrum, the low end of the spectrum from nutrient density standpoint. And they showed that from the low end of the spectrum, you would have to eat 3 apples to have the same nutrition that you would find in 1 apple from the high end of the spectrum. 4 butternut squash to 1, 5 bundles of kale to equal 1, 9 beets to equal the nutrient density and nutritive value of 1 beet from the higher end of that spectrum. That's a massive variation. That's huge. And not only does this have implications for efficiency of nutrient delivery, it also has implications for efficiency of use of land, for growing more nutrient-dense crops and providing more nutrition for all. So we talked about nutrient-dense plants. What about the plants out there that we as humans can't utilize? We can't digest them, we can't pull nutrition from them. That's where livestock come in. Livestock are nature's original upcyclers. They take plant stuffs that our bodies don't want anything to do with, and they create highly bioavailable, nutrient-dense, protein-packed meat, dairy, and eggs. And the advantage that not only these terrestrial animal products have, but also aquaculture, the advantage they have is that they create extremely bioavailable nutrients for our use. I'm giving you a crash course in human nutrition. We're talking about nutrient density, now we're talking about bioavailability. Bioavailability is absolutely the golden word when we talk about nutrients. It means that our body can more readily absorb and utilize that nutrient. So, when we look at a nutrient, a mineral like calcium, if you'd like to get 115 milligrams of calcium, you could either eat 16 cups of spinach, or you could drink 1 cup of cow's milk. Because although 16 cups of spinach and 1 cup of that cow's milk might look like they have the same amount of calcium, you actually are only absorbing about 5% of that calcium from spinach, because the bioavailability is low. When we talk about iron, bioavailability is absolutely key. There's heme iron that comes from animal products only, non-heme iron that comes from plant products. You can see behind me the bioavailability, that absorption rate. If you're eating spinach, you might absorb only 2% of the iron from the spinach that you're eating. But if you eat a steak, you're likely to absorb 35% of that iron. So when we're talking about efficiency of delivery of nutrients, animal products really pack a punch, particularly from the bioavailability standpoint. And we talked a bit about enrichment of soil to create healthier plants, to get more nutrition into plants. We can do something similar with animals. It's amazing. We can actually enrich an animal diet with micronutrients or essential fatty acids, and we can see those nutrients expressed in the meat, milk, eggs, and fish that they produce. So if we're looking at perhaps a selenium deficient region of the world, maybe their soil is very, very low in selenium content, perhaps they're not using some of those farming practices we talked about, we can actually enrich the animal diet, the dairy cow's diet, with selenium and see selenium expressed in the milk. Now we have selenium-enriched milk, cheese, yogurt, to help address those micronutrient deficiencies. We can do the same thing with docosahexaenoic acid and omega-3. It's amazing what can be done when we really focus on our nutrient inputs, on what we can get back from them. Now, a focus on nutrition, as much as I might like it to be, is not all altruistic. There is commercial value here too. We had a brief introduction to Paul Pullman. One of my favorite things that Paul said is he asked, how can a company profit from solving the world's problems? Because listen, companies are out there to make money. So we can either make money from creating more problems, or we can make money from solving problems. And lucky for us, the consumers who have the access to food, the ability to pay for food, the option to choose the foods that they would like to have, they're asking for an altruistic mission, they're asking for efficacious food products, they want more bang for their buck. They want more nutrition in each bite. 48% of consumers in the global Nielsen Health and Wellness Insight Survey that was just published last year, they said they would pay more for products that help them be proactive about their health. And really, that one didn't surprise me. I think that's about right. 50% of consumers saying, yeah, I'd pay more for that because it's better for my health. The one that surprised me is the 72% here. 72% of consumers were saying they felt like companies had a role to play in providing accessible nutrition for all. So they're not only asking for nutrition for themselves, they're asking us to provide nutrition for others as well. And you know what? They even said they'd pay for it. How great is that? Consumers are telling us they'll pay more. So those effects trickle back down that value chain, down that food chain. They are telling us we'll pay more for it. So those premiums, those values, they'll come back to us. Does it take time? Of course, absolutely. We're the ones who have to make the changes and be the drivers, but we can make money from it too. I'd be remiss if I didn't discuss transparency. I think this is really interesting. There are some companies out there who are actually developing these handheld meters for consumers to go into supermarkets, and at point of sale, they can use this little handheld spectrometer and beep, with a little flash of light, they can actually determine the nutrient density of this carrot versus that carrot. They can tell. This isn't a marketing ploy. You can't go out there and just say, yeah, we're using nutrient-dense practices. We're focusing on that. The consumers will know. Right now, there's only a database for plant products, but they're actually starting to work on a database for beef, and other animal products will follow. So this will be available for all of the common food products that we see on supermarket shelves. This is something that's, again, going to create demand for more nutrient-dense foods. So not only can we do the right thing, but we can make money from some of the consumers who want to pay, are willing to pay, are happy to pay more for something that benefits their health. As I close out, I want to bring attention back to another big idea. Dr. Mark Lyons mentioned it's not enough to be neutral. Neutrality is not enough. Enough food is not enough. The net positive impact on zero hunger and good health and well-being is nutrition. So as we're working together for a planet of plenty to feed those 10 billion people and beyond, we must remember that soil, plant, animal, environmental, and human health are all deeply interrelated. And our purpose, it's more than farming. It's more than food production. It's more than reduction of environmental impact. It is sustaining the life and health of the planet and the lives and health of the people who share it. Thank you very much.
Sneaking up behind you. Well done, Nikki.
Thank you.
Nice job.
Thanks.
So, might ask both of you a few questions. So, I think to kick things off, you've presented a lot of science there, a lot of ideas. How does this change the way we think about our land and the way we manage it?
And kick off?
Yeah, sure. You talk about food security, and not food security, but nutrient security more so, Nikki, and that's a really important point, because when we talk about the resources that we actually have to work with here to feed all of these people, they're pretty limited. We're talking about cultivatable land being about 4% of the Earth's surface, and pastures and rangelands being about 14. If we take that off the table, we're in trouble, because that stuff is primarily turning things that we can't eat into things that we can eat. And that's turning, obviously, things with no nutritional value into the highest nutritionally dense product in the world, in beef. So that's pretty important as we consider this whole thing that we talk about that.
You think about food waste. We've talked an awful lot about this. Food waste, if it was a country, it would be the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. What role does that play? And is there something both, from a nutritional perspective, but also perhaps from an environmental perspective that we could be thinking about in terms of waste management? What would happen if we didn't have livestock?
Yeah. I think it's really interesting when we think about the consumer perspective. We really have this complex about perfection. You go into the supermarket and everything's got to look the same. Everything's got to look perfect. But perfection and beauty in a food product does not equate to nutritional value. So there's a little bit of a consumer shift in mindset there. We need to be focused more on that nutrient density, maybe focused on using those nutrient density meters that I just mentioned in supermarkets, rather than a focus on perfection.
Just change a little bit the way we're thinking about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, the other piece, of course, in that is every time we waste food, we waste nutrients, right? And we don't have enough nutrients as it stands. But what we often don't consider is what happens to that food waste. What is happening with it right now? Not just the food waste, but all the byproducts of food production that happen to create all of this plant food. And that's that it's fed primarily to livestock and ruminants more so than others. And in fact, there's some recent research Dr. Vaughn just put out that showed that food waste or food byproducts that end up being composted, that's usually what they would expect you to do to it if you're not feeding it to an animal. 5 times more greenhouse gas than if it went through the cow itself. If they put it into a landfill, it creates 49 times more greenhouse gases than if you put it through the cow itself. So it's just as important to consider what happens if we don't have livestock than it does if we were to eat the food ourselves.
That goes right back to the modeling you were talking about and the importance of that to be able to demonstrate the difference. So that sequestration aspect, this is a topic I think a lot of people look at what we're doing at the beautiful Buck Island Ranch there. Is it a reality, and how would this sequestration type of idea become really a mainstream element of agriculture?
Yeah, as I mentioned a little bit in the talk, it's a lot of methodological challenges to making sure we can actually measure this on site with ranches, but it is certainly scalable. The whole world has soils in which we perform agriculture all the time, and soil carbon is critical to growing plants in the first place. So it is certainly scalable once we get the technology sorted out on how to measure it and how to affect it. A lot of excitement in the space of what can we do to actually improve the uptake of carbon into soils.
So Vaughn, I might say, when I have a question about a cow, I call Vaughn. When I have a question about a supplement, I call Nikki. And Nikki, it's interesting you were mentioning like that spinach thing. That kind of made me feel good, actually, of all the spinach salads I've missed. And maybe just have a glass of milk. But with a lot of supplements, I think there's questions around there. I'm quite interested in this area, what can be bioavailable. But if you think about supplementation, not simply actual supplements, but the supplementation of food, what is the potential there? And I think you've got the nutrient density meter is very interesting, but I think for a lot of people in the food industry, we're thinking, okay, how do I further differentiate my product?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as a dietitian, and Mark's heard me say this a million times, that I always focus on food first. Food is certainly the first source of nutrition. Supplements are just that. That's why they're named that. They're a supplement to a healthy diet. But supplements, as you mentioned, bioavailability there, we can tailor supplements to be perfectly bioavailable to a human's body. So for example, at Acutia, we have a selenium supplement, and our selenium is one of the most bioavailable minerals on the marketplace. It's amazing. So if you're not getting enough selenium through your diet, you may be selenium deficient. Actually, most people in the world are not taking in enough selenium no matter where you live. You actually can turn to supplements to find something that's incredibly bioavailable for your body.
Okay, So we've touched a couple of times, the impact, and it's going to be a topic I know that's going to come through the entire conference. Ukraine, what is the real impact, and what do we see in terms of both nutrition, enough available food for people, even environmental impact? What do you foresee, both of you, in terms of the impact that Ukraine could have?
Yeah.
You want me to take
pass
that
it
one?
over to
Sure,
Vaughn.
yeah, Vaughn will take it. Well, actually, I'll comment first if you don't mind,
Sure,
Vaughn.
go ahead.
There's so much more, as you mentioned, than just the humanitarian impact that we're seeing. As we know that you mentioned the fertilizer issue, the breadbasket of the world issue. So this is causing, of course, acute distress on our food supply. So acute distress on malnutrition, it's going to severely impact this across the world. We may not see much of it this year, but in the years to come, absolutely. The rising food prices, there's already enough people who don't have access to food. They can't afford food as it is. So these rising food prices are actually causing a crisis worldwide. It's absolutely significant. From a greenhouse gas standpoint, environmental, I'll kick it over to Vaughn.
Yeah, I think it just points to the fragility of our food system, Mark, more than anything else, right? I mean, we have this conflict that's going on in Ukraine, and all of a sudden the supply chains for most of what agriculture does. We're not just talking about the wheat coming out of there and the problems that that's causing in developing countries especially, but we're talking about fertilizer and everything else, and we're scrambling now. So I think it's critical to look at the robustness of our systems, to look at how we can improve those. But from an environmental standpoint, all that is going to do is you're taking it from the most efficient place to create a certain resource, and you're going to shift that somewhere else where it's made less efficiently. And whenever we do that, you hear a lot of discussion about let's reduce, let's say, beef production in the US or in Australia because they have enough. But that doesn't solve the problem. You get what Dr. Mitlerner calls leakage, is that somewhere else is just going to start making that product. It doesn't decrease the demand. We have to be really careful that we don't put interventions in place that actually have the opposite effect on the global situation.
So it's that idea too, we've got to be thinking as one planet.
Yes.
And the overall, think of the local issue and the global issue. And that, of course, is very complicated when we get into politics, something that seems to plague us. So just a final question then. Which is more important then, the nutrition or the environment?
He's really pitting us against each other, isn't he? Are you going to make us choose?
Yeah.
Well, I would, of course, like to say I think there's equal importance on both. But if I have to choose, I'm, of course, picking nutrition. Sorry, Vaughn. Sorry. Nutrition is absolutely important to do anything else that we need to do because we need humans to function. I talked about those individual consequences of malnutrition. So if we're not focused on nutrition, we have this cycle of poverty and malnutrition. We have a decreased number of children who are educated or have the cognitive ability to finish school that can go on to become researchers to help with the sustainability issue. We have decreased number of adults in the workforce that can be laborers. Am I winning?
I think you just waved the white flag.
Every time I think of a comeback, you address it in the next sentence. Nikki, I've got to agree with you. I think our primary role as an industry is always going to be nutrition. We obviously, to do that, are going to need to take care of the other issue simultaneously, as I pointed out several times. So we will end up in the situation where we can't provide nutrition because the environment is changing. So you've got to say both, and they're both equally important, and I think we have a responsibility to take care of both issues.